Welcome to another episode of the Revival Project podcast series. The Revival Project promotes non-political events and activities that aim to strengthen bonds between Jewish communities in the diaspora and in Israel. Today's topic is how selective should the Aliyah process be? This, some might say, controversial subject follows our previous discussion about the need for strengthening bonds in the Jewish world. Before we can approach the non-political goals of the Revival Project events and activities, gaining an insight as to the current status of these relations helps put things into clearer perspective. Accordingly, we are first acknowledging the sad but indisputable fact that we are talking about two separate entities, the Jewish diaspora and Israel, which many consider to be the Jewish homeland. There is a time-honored process of merging these entities together, and that relates to a Jew in the diaspora coming to live in Israel. This is called making Aliyah. Aliyah in Hebrew means going up. So if and when Jews in Israel get to decide who is eligible for making Aliyah, that alone might be considered something that serves to widen rather than strengthen bonds between the two entities in question. Now, I'm not advocating for a moment that we should have an open border policy. I do, however, question the dynamics it involves where we become the gatekeeper, effectively deciding who's going to live in Israel or not. So now I think it's time to get other views on this subject. My first guest on this show is the renowned presenter of the popular Aliyah Trail, broadcast many years now on Israel National News. Dr. Sam Minskoff, welcome and thank you for joining this special episode.
Thank you, Dave. It's good to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
My question to you is, should Jews with opposing political views to our own be discouraged from making Aliyah?
The question here, as you were saying, should Jews with opposing political views to our own be discouraged from making Aliyah? My response right off the bat is certainly not. Certainly not. The more political views, the better. The important thing is that they're Jews, and it would be helpful to them to have that Zionistic fervor and enthusiasm and belief, perhaps. But a Jew who desires to make Aliyah, if all the rules and papers are in order with them, they are certainly entitled. They're entitled to it by God, and we're not to question that. And the more views, the better. You know, it's after a while you'll have a hybrid mixture of opinions and whichever, and it can only work out nicely in the end for everybody.
The next question is the flip side of the first one. Bearing in mind that Jews once settled in Israel get a vote, which can affect our lives here, should we only encourage Jews with a similar world outlook to our own to come and live in Israel? Such questions don't reflect my own outlook, but looking around, hearing what people say in the diaspora and in Israel, in politics and elsewhere, leaves one a little bit skeptical and seeking answers to such questions.
Okay, as for the next issue that you bring up, bearing in mind that Jews settled in Israel get a vote that can affect our lives here, we only encourage Jews with a similar world outlook to our own to come and live in Israel. A similar world outlook with a whole bunch of Jews making Aliyah, I don't think that's even possible. I'm not even so sure if even God wants it that way. But it's certainly opinions, outlooks, and whatever, certainly should not be a requirement, for making Aliyah. There's enough requirements that you have to be Jewish, on the mother's side, whatever it is it takes to be a Jew, according to halacha and according to Torah, I think is enough. A Jew is a Jew regardless of what opinions that they may have. And they should, by all means, be encouraged, not discouraged.
The final question to you is, how can we strengthen bonds between Israel and the Jewish diaspora in light of such known differences, especially some of the points you have made?
These are good questions. And this next question you brought up also is the one about the how can we strengthen bonds between Israel and the Jewish diaspora in light of such known differences? Yes, there are differences, and the best way to strengthen bonds is through exposure, is to continue to have programs here like Young Israel, exposing diaspora Jews to the way we live here. We've turned a lot of heads around doing that, from what I understand, because whatever news they're getting about Israel in the States, when they finally come here and visit, having our programs, Young Israel, whichever, is to guide them around the country, their minds are quickly changed. So yes, they need more information, a lot of more outreach, and that would be very helpful so they know what to do when they finally get here. They'll be more familiar, housing, how to make a living, and so forth. That would definitely make a big difference.
Thank you, Dr. Sam Minskoff, and I recommend you hear his show, the Aliyah Trail, on the Israel National News website. However, what we now understand is that Jews are very, very welcome to live in Israel from the diaspora, but there are many who prefer, of course, to remain in the diaspora. Perhaps there's also a remaining problem if they perceive that those in Israel are only interested in them providing they make Aliyah to Israel. Then that also begs the question, how do they feel about the fact that they want to remain in the diaspora? Are those in Israel still regarding them as brothers, as part of the Jewish nation? But really, I don't think there is an issue here. I think it's a very simple matter of longing, where people long for their relatives, they long for their friends. Those in Israel obviously prefer to see their relations, their friends, and what have you, coming to live with them nearby in Israel, where they're not so far away. And I'm sure the reverse is true, where those in the diaspora also prefer to see those they love in Israel living close to them. So there is a dichotomy here. There is a lingering problem, but that's something which we'll get to in due time. My next guest is the founder and CEO of the Tabernacle Institute. The ancient tabernacle was the focal point of Jewish worship and therefore served to strengthen the relationship between Jews. Ben Levine, welcome.
So glad to be here.
Many may not be aware of your dedicated work to expose the historic plight of Jews in Lithuania. I hear you have a book on this subject recently published, which we hope to talk about very soon. But first, I'd like to ask you a question, which is, to what extent do you think we are thickening a line between Jews in the diaspora and Israel through not only immigration policies, but our attitude towards immigrants coming in from the diaspora? And by this, I'm referring to the political taint which seems to follow successive coalition governments.
Well, it's a great question, but I think before we answer what is happening now between diaspora Jews and Jews in Israel, I think we need to understand a little bit about what's been going on for the past 100 years to get a better feel for why there is this great split. Roughly 100 years ago, a lot of Jews started moving from Eastern Europe and Russia to the States. And then there was the first Aliyah in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Many Jews roughly at the same time started moving to Eretz Israel. These two groups have been developing very different self-identities over the past 100 years. The American group, by and large, have considered themselves as lucky they got to the shores of the land of the free, and they became very Americanized to the extent that they really thought of themselves as American Jews, not just Jews. And with the generations, there's been less and less emphasis on the Jewish part and more emphasis on the American part, with the assimilation and the intermarriage and all of the rest that goes along with that. Quite the opposite's happened in Israel. In Israel, the moment Jews set foot on this soil, they have been in a survival mode. And that has that constant pressure, both of poverty to some extent and danger, has created a different mentality in Israeli Jews, and they've thought themselves more and more Israeli slash Jewish, and less simply a national identity. It was all intertwined into one identity.
So in one respect, it does thicken the line between Jews in the diaspora and Jews in Israel, which could segue into my next question, Ben, which is from what you mentioned about the existential threat which we have in Israel, but obviously this is something which Jews in the diaspora face, and the question really is, when you start looking at world political circumstances, not least of all what's happening in Ukraine today, how much do you think the question of blanket anti-Semitism to a life-threatening degree plays into the argument about how selective Jews in Israel are as far as who is going to be coming into Israel?
Well, let me go back to what you'd mentioned, that I'd written a book about Lithuanian Jewry in the first half of the 20th century. And an interesting phenomena took place there that is taking place in the diaspora today, and we'll explain better why we are where we are right now in terms of being selective and in terms of being more careful as to who comes in and who doesn't. And it's like this. In Lithuania, the same story could be told for other Eastern European countries, but my expertise is with Lithuania. In Lithuania, Jews lived there for 600 years as perfect citizens and with absolute rights and citizenship, exactly like they are right now in the U.S. and in Canada and in Europe, other parts of Europe. So, but when the situation got grave, then that 600 years of living in harmony went out the window overnight. You may know that in Lithuania, in the first month of the German attack on Lithuania, first couple of months, that 90% of Lithuanian Jewry were murdered by Lithuanians, not by Germans.
Ben, I think this subject deserves more than a few minutes, and I'll be delighted if you'll come as my guest on a future show. With so much to explore on this in this area here. So for now, really, we've heard from Ben Levine, founder and CEO of the Tabernacle Institute, and it's our great pleasure for our audience over here that Ben Levine has kindly offered to give a very special. Very special offer, I should say, to the first 100 of you who come onto the Diaspora Trail. Get there, look at the shop over there, and we're offering a very, very special deal for you. Thanks to Ben Levine's generosity.
My pleasure.
Well, that just about wraps it up for this week's show. And really, it'd be great to hear your comments, what your thoughts are. Should really Israel be very, very selective in terms of which countries immigrants come from? And they can actually be selective because, believe it or not, there are a lot of quotas involved with who comes in and how they come in, and these things are not so public as they should be. But just for example, they can have Jewish agency representatives in various countries, which can open up and fast track people coming in, for example, as in Ukraine today, or they can even slow it down if they wish to. God bless, be well, and look forward to speaking with you again soon. Stay on the trail, and we are getting it together.